All right. So this is where we left off last time, right? We kind of had the UV unwrapping pretty well laid out here, right? I can go to 3 for face mode, Control A to select, and you can basically see our UVs all right in here. Now, like I said before, if we wanted to or needed to maybe make minor adjustments here, remember that is one of the things that we can actually do, right? It's kind of, move this over a little bit. I can always go back in here, and obviously this is kind of that big chunk right there. If you wanted to kind of cut this up into a little more pieces to adjust it, you can always add a few seams here or there. It's up to you and what you feel like you need. In this case, though, I'm just going to go to UV, Live Unwrap, right? So that way that's checked on. And then, of course, we have our tweak tool on because I kind of like having the tweak tool on for that. And what we could do is we could just go and kind of place a few points, right? I could select a point here. So remember, 1 for vertex mode, right? And then what you can do is you can just kind of select a few vertices. Remember, Shift can add to your vertex selection. And so I just kind of want to place a couple of vertices in kind of some spots around the border here, right? So you can kind of see a few of those. If I right-click, right, it brings up the UV context menu, and I could pin these, right? Once those are pinned, you'll see the red. And what's cool is you can actually grab and drag to adjust them. So you see how I can kind of play with this section a little bit right here just to kind of get it a little less distorted. So you can always kind of come in here and make some adjustments to kind of help the distortion go a little bit less. You can always add pins, so I can select another vertex, right-click pin. And now that that's pinned, I can tweak that. And you see how as you kind of make these adjustments, you can just get less and less distortion here, right? So this is one of those things that, like we said, if you play around with these pins and you make a few pins, you should be able to help yourself kind of just have a less distorted part here. So keep that in mind, right, that these are some little adjustments that you can make and play around with a little bit. Add pins where you need to, kind of move them around to see how much adjustment you can get on that. If you need to add more pins, of course you can as well. So this is a way to kind of make little adjustments to maybe make sure the distortion's a bit less minimal. At this point, we can always go back here and make some adjustments for that one, but you always kind of keep an eye out on the checkerboard grid there just to kind of see how things looking. But this is one of the cool things about the live unwrap is that it really does give you kind of a neat way to kind of play with and adjust this in a unique and interesting way, right? So keep in mind, right, that the pins are quite cool and a quite neat function, and they can really allow you to play with and adjust this to maybe get it a little less distorted. Remember, you're not really trying to get zero distortion, just low distortion. So keep in mind that, right, you just make sure live unwrap's on. You can be in vertex mode 1, right, for vertex mode. Select some vertices, right-click, you can pin them. And then, of course, I like to go to Control A to select all, and then right-click to unpin. And now you see those have been unpinned. You could turn live unwrap off. You do have some other functions here, like relax or pinch for UVs. So if you want to turn that relax tool on, you can play with that a little bit. I found that kind of relax often creates a little bit of distortion. So it is there, though, but you have like a little relax tool. There is a grab tool for making adjustments also. So you do have kind of a few tools right here. There's even rip region. If you select some faces, you can just rip them apart. I myself tend to find the live unwrap a better choice for getting lower distortion than these. But they are available. And live unwrap's kind of cool, right? At this point, I can select all, Control A again. We can go to UV menu. And, of course, we have pack islands, and that can repack everything so they're not on top of each other. You can always try hitting fill as well, because that can kind of just, you see fill will stretch them a little bit, though, so you have to be a little bit careful with that. So you have some cool functions there. You can adjust them. Remember, text tools is great for this stuff. In this case, I'm just going to maybe, go to 4, because that'll be island mode, right? Remember, 1, 2, 3, 4 still actually have functions in the UV editor itself. So I'm going to hit R for scale if I wanted to, and I could scale up a few of these bits right here. And maybe make them a little bit bigger. Remember, you do need to be careful about not making them too big because you don't want to have your texels become too distorted. Right? Remember, you have kind of your texel control here, right? So you can see texel size. Usually the ratio should be close to 1, but it really depends on what you need, right? Sometimes you might really feel like you need more resolution for certain parts, and so you may scale them up a little bit. Also, you try to waste not a lot of pixels, right? All the areas where there's no UVs, those are going to be pixels that aren't used. And so if you've got a little bit of room and you can go in here and maybe make some minor adjustments, take advantage of it, right? No reason you can't. So I'll often just come in here and do a little bit of my own manual repacking to kind of make some minor adjustments. There we go. Maybe make this part a little smaller, R for scale. But you don't want the adjustments to be too noticeable, too big, right? Basically, a prime example of going too far would be something like this, right? If I was to take this large chunk right here, this is most of the armor. See how it's the biggest part in our scene? If I make this super, super small, you see how radically different the actual checkerboard size is versus this? That can kind of give you a decent representation of your texel ratio, right? Most of these parts have a noticeably decent checkerboard where you've got like 10 by 10, right? And this is way large. So you can see that this is taking up very few pixels. So when you actually go to textures later on, this is going to be blurry and low resolution, and these are going to be high resolution. That's what a texel ratio of 1 is trying to avoid, is that there's basically an even distribution of pixels that's pretty good relative to the actual model size. But you notice that scaling some of these parts up a little bit doesn't radically alter it. Like we scale these parts up a little bit. So they take up a little more texel space, right? So you can see a lot of these, you can scale them up a bit, and you'll still have a pretty good texel ratio. So keep in mind that really kind of depends on what you need, what you're looking for resolution-wise. But remember, texel really just stands for texture element. It's kind of a nice way of saying island and how many pixels that island gets relative to the other islands, basically, right? So just keep that in mind, right? Sizing these a little bit is not going to hurt you, right? See how that distribution is still quite good? You wouldn't really be able to notice. But obviously, there's a point where you make things too large or too small, and that ratio gets out of whack, right? All right, so that should be good for that. Like I said, I did want to do some sculpting with you guys today as well. So what we can do is we can go to 4 for object mode. And we're basically ready just to go to our blue wrench, add modifier, mirror. So I can mirror it over. And then, of course, what we could do is we can hit apply all. And there we go. And now we've got our UVs laid out. And if I turn the visibility on for the quad body, we can see that we've got, turn that visibility on, we've got overall pretty good UVs, right? We can look at that and we see that this is all looking pretty checkerboard, right? And if you can look at your UVs and you see checkerboard and it's looking like a pretty good, pretty low distortion checkerboard, you've got pretty good UVs, right? So UV unwrapping a more complicated creature character. Not much to it, just not terribly exciting, right? So I just wanted to reiterate a little bit about texel elements and the live UV unwrap features. All right, so at this point, I usually don't like the checkerboard grid on anymore. So remember, you can go from your UV editing workspace, right, to your shading workspace. And you can see right here that there's basically one material on everything. The TT Checker 248 UV grid. That's the material that Blender basically created for this model for the UVs. So in fact, remember, when we go to shading, we get to see our shader tree here. And there's just one material on everything. Much like kind of my default material that's on all the objects, right? So basically, we can see here that there's the UV grid. So it's easy to just select the kind of orange right, node, because that's your texture. Delete it, and then the UV grid's gone. At this point, if we want to, we could actually rename this material. So I can just click right in here, right? You can kind of see how there's the material name right there. So you can click on that, and you can rename it, right? Call this maybe quad body. There we go. And then, of course, we can go to this one. You see how this one has that quad body also, right? Right here. Now, this one that looks like 2 pages, right? It's a couple over. It's right here, 2 pages. It's right in this area. If you click on that, that makes a new body. And since this one's the currently selected one, you see how it's quad body 1. So what I can do is I can just rename that to be quad gear. And now you'll see that if I click on this model, see how it's quad body. If I click on this one, it's quad gear. So quite easy to create new materials, rename materials, kind of play with the nodes in the shading area. In fact, Blender's overall shader node network's quite user-friendly, right? So just these little things that you can go over here and do just to get you a little more prepped for texture painting later on and to have your materials already set up. So remember, shading is where you can go to kind of work a little more easily with your material stuff, right? You can always do it from the kind of red magenta ball here, right? And you'll see that the same kind of controls are right here. There's quad gear, right? If I select this model, quad body, you can rename them there. But it's often pretty easy to do it right here through the shader node network as well. And this area is where you can name your material, where you can assign a different material, right? As well as even make a new one. You'll have these controls right here as well. Like right there, add a material slot, new material, you can rename it, you can pick which one to put on there. So remember, you have the reddish magenta kind of sphere, and that has all these material properties, but the shader node network has them right here as well. So just kind of a little bit more about that stuff, right? Save that. And I'm going to go to sculpting menu now, right? So I'm going to go to sculpting, because now we're going to be focusing primarily on sculpting. Now in this case, I'm going to turn quad gear off visibility-wise, all right? And we can see our sculpting tools are up. And of course, we need to add a multi-resolution modifier, right? So remember that blue wrench in our properties menu here is for our modifiers. And we go to add modifier, and we find the multi-resolution right here, right? So remember, this is blue wrench in your properties area, add modifier, multi-resolution. And we now have a multi-resolution modifier on here. Now you'll notice that since we've got a multi-resolution applied and our sculpt tools are on, you'll notice that the symmetry is up here, because one of the things you can't do with sculpting is the mirror modifier, right? Sculpting and multi-resolution, you'll see automatically the mirror will go away. If you have a mirror modifier on and then you add a multi-resolution modifier later, you'll see that the mirror modifier goes away. The multi-resolution modifier and the mirror modifier don't play that well together. So when you're getting ready to do sculpting, what you end up doing is instead of using a mirror modifier for symmetry, you'll notice that when you're in sculpt mode, right, and it's actually really any mode, not any mode. 1, you'll see that this is available. 2, 3, it's available. 4, you'll see it disappears. When you're in object mode, you do not get that. But you see it is available for 1, 2, and 3, and 5, right? So if we hit 5, you see it's also available here. And what you can do is you can just turn on X. So believe it or not, you actually have symmetry for sculpting and painting, and actually really selecting and manipulating, right? So if you still wanted without a mirror modifier to move, rotate, scale, tweak, sculpt, you could turn these on and you still get that functionality, right? It's just that if you want to do things like loop cuts or extrusions or bridges, kind of the more normal modeling tools, this won't do that, right? You have to have the mirror modifier for those things. So this symmetry is much more for shaping, right, than it is for full modeling where you're going to extrude and loop cut and bridge and all that stuff. So remember, this is quite important if you want symmetry sculpting or symmetry tweaking to be on. We can see our multi-resolution modifiers on over here. And we've seen it before a little bit, right? We saw it with our primary form shaping. Now we really want to take advantage of full high resolution sculpting. And that's really what we're going to be doing today and pretty much all of next week. So I need to start to subdivide this. Now, how much you can subdivide it's going to depend on your devices, guys. So if your device starts to poop out at like 2 million polygons, okay, that's your limit, right? A reasonably good computer that's got an actual, real, proper gaming 3D card. Doesn't have to be an RTX card, right? You don't have to have ray tracing on it to get good performance. It's ray tracing. You could get easily tens of millions of polygons, right? I usually, when I'm doing sculpting on my own personal stuff, I can easily get a scene that's like 30, 40 million polygons for a couple of objects. And it runs well and it performs well and the sculpting's responsive. That's going to vary depending on the horsepower your machine has, right? Your device. So, guys, do your best on that, right? Push it as many polygons as you can without your computer exploding, basically. So I'm going to subdivide, right? Because this is how you get it. So we subdivide. And that should not have jumped right to 3. What was that about? Let's go down some levels. That was weird. All right. So it should not have jumped right to 3, but it did. But you usually have to subdivide, and it'll go to 1, subdivide it'll go to 2, subdivide it'll go to 3. Clearly, I'm going to go in here and do a little bit of smoothing to smooth those areas out. Because that was a bit on the weird side. That's okay. Remember, shift is smooth. Man, that went weird with that modifier. Let me delete that modifier and try this one more time. Multi-resolution. There we go. Subdivide. There we go. My modifier just went temporarily insane. Now it is absolutely working fine. That was weird. Never had that happen before. So sometimes just delete the modifier, right? Just the X gets rid of the modifier and start over, right? Because we didn't do any work. So I'll kind of leave it at maybe level 3. So I'm going to subdivide one more time so we get to level 3. You can actually have level viewport is kind of when you're not in sculpt. Like if you get 4, this is what controls what it looks like in 4, right? Object mode. If you're in 5, sculpt controls that. And render is for when you render it. But you have to subdivide. That's all this is really doing, right? The secret to high resolution detailing, it's not really a secret. It's more polygons, right? It's getting up to millions and millions of polygons. So we're just subdividing, all right? That's just taking every quad, and it subdivides it into 4 smaller quads, and then subdivides those quads into 4 smaller quads when you do it level 2, and so on and so forth. And you subdivide it enough times, and you get to millions of polygons. And then you're just using sculpting brushes to shape millions of polygons. There's no magic behind this. This is the way ZBrush works, Mudbox, Moto, any Cinema 4D, right? All these packages that actually have sculpting built in with proper multi-resolution stuff, right? 3D Studio Max and Maya don't have this properly built in, right? You'd have to use Mudbox if you want to stay in the Autodesk family. Of course, ZBrush does this. ZBrush originated it all. But other packages like Blender, Cinema 4D, Moto all actually have some pretty good high multi-resolution sculpting built in. So multi-resolution really allows you to go up and down the levels. In fact, with my brush in the viewport, page down actually goes down levels, right? And page up goes up levels. So you can easily go up and down your levels just using page up, page down, all right? So that's what's cool about multi-resolution is you can delete it when you need to later on, right? In fact, we'll do the sculpting, then make a normal map out, and then get rid of it so that we have a normal map on the low res instead of the sculpt. But you can actually work at any level. So you can go up and down the levels and work at whatever level you need to. That's what it means by multi-resolution, right? It's actually a really good name for it. Moto basically used the same thing as well. So he's now over there. Yeah. So basically, multi-resolution really just means that, multi-resolution. We all know what resolution means in the context of, like cameras and video games, right? More pixels, right? Difference between 1080 and 4K, right? More pixels. here it's more polygons, and multi-resolution lets us work at the different resolutions, right? So quite appropriately named, actually. So we've got that on. Remember, all of our sculpting brushes are over here. You can actually scroll down with the scroll wheel. Although, if you want to, and I like this, I'll actually just kind of left-click drag that little bar there, so I see all of them just in 2 rows. We'll probably stick mostly with the blue ones for now, the blue brushes up here. This first one is your draw. It's your regular push sculpting tool. Your brush size is right here, although S and drag will control that size as well, right, radius. But also your brackets, left and right bracket, right, can go down or up by units of like 7, I think. Your strength's right here, and you can also have it strength pressure if you've got a Wacom tablet, right? If you don't really have to worry about that, but that can be turned off and on. And of course, as we've seen before, right, we can just zoom in a little bit and left mouse drag to sculpt it. And we can pull that out. So I'm just holding down left mouse button. I can then zoom in a little bit more. I can hold down control to push in, right? And you see how I can kind of define and shape this stuff a little better. Maybe a little bit of left mouse button to sculpt that out a bit again. Left mouse button here to sculpt this out a little bit there. Control the inverse, right, because that allows us to push in. And you see how it kind of allows us to define these forms a little bit better. So a big part of all of this modeling is pushing and pulling, right? Left mouse button by default is plus, and that pulls the surface outward, right? Control, which is negative, and you see other buttons for it right here too. It's just the control keys are much better, right? The quick keys shortcuts are much better. Inverses, right? It'll push the geometry in. So I could easily just come in here and just, hold down control here to push this in a little bit, to define that a little better. Left mouse button to kind of pull these out. Also, in sculpt mode, F, remember F is frame selection, normal modeling, which is very useful. F in sculpt mode is like F in mode box. It's focus. So when you hit F, what it does is it sets your camera rotate around the actual area you're sculpting on. Depending on the brush size, it'll also kind of pull out the brush size will kind of determine the zoom. Remember, shift will smooth, so we can always go in here and hold down smooth to kind of soften some of these areas a little bit. Besides, we can kind of start to define the horn sticking out a little bit more. We can go in here. We can hold down control to push in there. And you see how we can just start to define these forms better, right? So we were really focusing earlier on just getting kind of the major forms out here. And I'm doing this with the mouse, so my stroke might not be quite as clean as I'd normally like it. But you see how control pushes in. Shift will smooth. Remember, you can go to the wrench and screwdriver here, because that's your tool properties. And you can always go to unified strength right here. It's off because I was using this scene file earlier, but just double check to make sure it's off. And if you go to smooth, which is the first orange brush right here, right? You can actually change the strength to make it less, right? Sometimes the strength default size is a little high, so it kind of smooths too much. So remember, if you go to the wrench and screwdriver and you just turn off unified strength, which is that one right there, it's like right there, right? That'll actually take care of, and I feel like that's a little bit off here, so let's maybe make this a smidge smaller. We can see that a little better. All right, so it looks like that stretches a little bit on this projector. There we go. So it's kind of right there, right? Okay, so remember that you can turn that off, and then you can just go to strength itself and make sure that strength's lower. But you see how they don't have to match? That's what's cool about that. And it's just really shift smooth, right? It softens these shapes and forms out. So a lot of your sculpting is really just pulling out. Hold down control to push in, right? Shift for smooth so you can soften stuff. Rarely do things have a hard kind of line delineating or breaking it. So a little bit of softening never hurts, right? Shift for smooth. And one of the things we can also do is look at some of these other tools. And we're going to keep sculpting and do a lot more sculpting over the next couple days. But the last of the blue tools up here, right? Because you see how they're kind of color-coded, right? The blue ones, there's one called crease. It's right here. And what's cool about crease is it actually is already set to negative. You'll see that it's set to have a little bit of pinch. So if you go to the brush menu here, there's a pinch control. And depending on how many polygons you have, you'll see how it automatically can do kind of a cool crease. So you can start to get wrinkles. Right? So I can come in here and I can start to crease out areas where I want there to be, well, a crease, right? Kind of the eyelids are going to tend to have it. Where you want to start to maybe get some wrinkles, right? You can start to kind of get those in there. So crease is actually really, really cool. And it can be something you start to use to develop and pull some shapes and forms out. So we could crease these areas up here a little bit because there's probably going to be a little bit of wrinkling and bunching up there. So, of course, you have your draw, which will allow you to do general push and pull shaping. But crease is kind of got the pinch built in, and it can be a great way to do, well, creases, right? It's a pretty self-explanatory tool. You can hold down Shift to do a little smooth, right? So Shift works always to smooth. Whatever brush you're in, Shift will smooth from there. And that's actually pretty universally true. Just about all sculpting tools will use Shift for smooth. ZBrush does, Mudbox does. And you see how that creasing allowed us to add finer details. And we don't have to retop all these parts, right? That's going to be baked into our normal map. So I think that'll be a great place to stop this today. And then we'll come back for our next lecture and do some more sculpting and creasing.